the numbers may not be accurate, but the numbers are probably still telling you something. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is understanding, is it points of data or is it actually starting to demonstrate a trend? Mm. And a trend means that we have enough data that we're actually seeing a path. An up path, a down path, a straight path, whatever, a ziggy path, whatever it happens to be, right? But even when we don't have a full trend, we still usually have some data. And to me, that's part of where we start is we say, we've got a little bit of data. Let's start with that. And then that's where we go to the intuition and say, and then where does our gut land on this? Right?
Are you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. Numbers alone won't tell you if your strategy is working, and neither will your feelings. Great leaders make decisions based on a mix of indicators. They don't just make decisions based on a gut check, based on which way the wind is blowing, or a big pile of spreadsheets. So today, Gwen and I, but mostly Gwen, to be honest, pretty much all Gwen, like it's a 90-10 split today. Gwen's going to break down how to evaluate your strategy in real time so that you don't stick with something too long, but also don't abandon it too soon. So Gwen, I want you to just kick us off. When it comes to evaluating strategy in real time, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to be aware of?
So I think a key thing is understanding there's two elements. One element is very tactical, which is data, right? And it's things that we can track. And the other is very soft and gooey, which is intuition. Because at some point, intuition is really, really valuable. However, as women, often we conflate our emotion and our intuition. And when we do that inappropriately, that becomes problematic. As one of my favorite people, Jason Campbell, who is a grandmaster and does a ton about breath work. One of the things he talks about is he says, women have a 220 where men have have a 120 in the connection between our, the third eye, that whole intuition piece and our gut. And he says, women have this wonderful, strong cord. And so, and he'll ask this, he'll say, how many times has your intuition actually been wrong? And women will kind of hem and haw and he'll say, not your emotion, your actual intuition. And they'll kind of smile and he says, 100%. He says, I don't know any woman. It's not right 100% of the time. When it's not right, it was usually driven by emotion. He says, but that's also the problem with this great connection is our emotions are also stronger. And so it's easier to confuse the two and conflate the two. And when we can start separating, is this an intuition? Is this an intuitive thing? As opposed to, am I reacting to my emotions? That piece, I think, is a huge piece that can be driving our strategic decisions in concert with the data.
Yeah. Okay. So before we can get to the data, I'm still a little fuzzy. And if I'm fuzzy, our listeners are fuzzy too. Because in my head, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out what would be an example that I could give that would explain the difference between intuition and emotion. And I'm not coming up with one.
So
how do you describe them?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you my example that was my time that I finally understood my intuition was 100% correct.
Okay.
So this was years ago when I was working in a corporate job leading a team, and we were hiring somebody new that was going to work directly for me in a role, it was well defined, all the rest of it. The resume that came in, this person checked every single solitary box. I interviewed them, my boss interviewed them, several coworkers and kept checking all of the boxes. And my gut, truly my gut, said this person is a bad hire. It wasn't because I didn't like the person. There wasn't any emotional energy around it. Okay. It was just this feeling that I could not logically explain, right? At all. Could not for the life of me explain it. And because I'm such a high logic, that made me doubt my intuition on it. And like my boss, thought this guy was going to be great. And I really trusted my boss.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we're just going to do it. I never said anything because I couldn't explain it. It was like, but like I said, I also knew there wasn't any fear, anger, all the things that would be emotional words around it. It was just this weird feeling. And once we got him hired, within about 3 months, realized it was a really bad hire. And it was one of those, it's like, yep, I knew that, but I couldn't explain it. In this case, I could tell there was going to be a cultural mismatch. Was what was going to happen. I now, looking back, I could see that. At the time, though, I could not put those words. I couldn't put those words to it. Right. So for me, the way you start distinguishing it is to say, is it something that I know to be true without ever being able to put any necessary words around it? To me, that's intuition.
Okay.
Right. As opposed to I feel something about it. Right. I feel anxious. I feel nervous. I feel scared. I feel because I didn't feel anything about it. It's just like, this just seems wrong. Just seems wrong. And from that point forward, I started really trusting my intuition. And as Jason would say, it has always been correct.
So can you give me an example? Now that you've explained intuition versus emotion, like in a practical example, I think most of us have encountered, whether it was with a hire or even just meeting a friend or relative significant other.
Oh yeah, exactly.
How might that look in a business strategy scenario?
So in a business strategy, it could be that I'll just pick on a marketing, example, because I think a lot of people deal with this in their marketing worlds, right? Where you're working with someone and they say, and I'm just picking something completely at random, and they say, what you really need to be doing is you need to be emailing your people, twice a week instead of once a week. And your gut says, no, that's not going to actually change anything. Not because you have data, not because you have anything else. You just know instinctively, it's like, nope, that's not going to do it. And it's not because, oh, that's so exhausting, I don't want to do it. Or, God, I don't know what I'm going to say. Or, that there's any emotion that you can just say, nope, I don't think that's right. Okay. That would be a place where we're applying our strategy. We're trying to make better contact with our customers or whatever around our marketing. And we're saying, yeah, my gut says this tactic isn't the tactic.
Okay.
To make it happen. Right. And often our intuition is partly being in touch with the broader energy, of the universe and our people. And often we can't explain it. It's just like, I know my people well enough to know that it's not like 2 is going to annoy them. Like I'm not going to, get a whole bunch of people aren't going to unsubscribe because I'm doing it twice a week. It's just work that's not going to deliver any ROI. Right. So to me, that's where we start practically, looking at it, is to say, does this still, and I hate to use this word because I'm using it as the emotion, but does it feel right? Does my gut say this makes sense? Or does my gut say this doesn't make any sense at all, even if I can't explain it?
So when it comes to strategy, because what I think is really important about this episode, because it is airing for the first time at the beginning of the year in Q1. And no matter how hard you and me try to evangelize the opposite, a lot of people do their planning in a vacuum, because there are a lot of people out there that teach you to do your planning in a vacuum. And what I mean by doing your planning in a vacuum, which is it's like all future focused, and it's not effectively using the past to inform the future. It's not taking things outside of your control really into consideration. It's just, I'm going to make $1 million because I said I'm going to make $1 million or whatever. it's round about this time of the year that things start to look a little hairy, or it's like, well, gosh, if I'm trying to make $1 million this year and I haven't made $100 yet, I don't know how, I could start off on January 1 saying that's okay, I can just make it up tomorrow. But by February 2nd, I needed to make at least $1 in order for me to really feel good about saying I'm going to make $1 million in the next 11 months. And so this is the time when people start going, oh my gosh, do I need to switch gears? And sometimes they're like ready to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. They're like, maybe I need a new business model. Maybe I need to fire everything, start from scratch, new offers.
Been there, live that.
Right. And sometimes they're like, nope, I made a plan and I must stick with it all 12 months, which you and me have been in business long enough to say that neither extreme is typically the right answer. It may be, but I haven't seen it in a situation where either extreme was the right answer. So there's this place where you got to kind of look at things and see if the writing on the wall tells you anything. But that early in the game, oftentimes your numbers aren't a reliable indicator because it takes time for anything good or bad to really manifest itself in the data. So that's why I think it's important to be paying attention now. But my question for you, Gwen, if the numbers aren't trustworthy a month in, 2 months in to say the strategy, what do you do? What do you look at?
So this part of this is where the intuition comes in because I will agree with you that the numbers may not be accurate, but the numbers are probably still telling you something. Mm-hmm. And so part of it is understanding, is it points of data or is it actually starting to demonstrate a trend? Mm. And a trend means that we have enough data that we're actually seeing a path, an up path, a down path, a straight path, whatever, a ziggy path, whatever it happens to be, right? But even when we don't have a full trend, we still usually have some data. And to me, that's part of where we start is we say, we've got a little bit of data. Let's start with that. And then that's where we go to the intuition and say, and then where does our gut land on this? One of the things, when we talk about planning and people, well, I love we're going to make $1 million this year. They say, we're going to make $1 million this year. And it's like, okay, but you're coming into the year having made $100,000 last year, right? Mm-hmm. Just picking some random numbers. So you've got to grow 10 times. Now, the reality of this next month, you're going to make the same as you did all last year, probably isn't very realistic unless you have some really unique thing that's coming out that's, changing everything, right? So what that really says is next month, instead of making, 8 or 9 or 10, we need to make 12. But that means the next month we need to make 20, which means the next month. So by the time we actually get to December, we're not needing to make $100,000 to make $1 million. We're probably needing to make $125,000, or something, right? So part of it is, are we looking at the data in a way that's realistic, right? So because someone could look and say, well, I only made $12,000 this month. There's no way I'm going to hit $1 million. It's like, yeah, but if you actually can keep that month over month growth, you'll probably get really close to $1 million by the time you get to December, right? But no, you did not make $100,000 this month, and you're not going to make $100,000 probably next month. But if you went from, 8 to 12, that's a 50% growth, which means next month you would go from 12 to 18, which means, all of a sudden those, if you can keep that up, it's like, oh, wait, that actually is getting me pretty close to the number that I'm trying to get to. Right. So part of it is looking at the data, but also with some gut to say, does this actually fit what I think the reality is? And part of it is understanding your gut saying, do I have enough time to actually be evaluating this yet? Now, using the exact same example, instead of making 12, let's say the last month of December, you made 8, because that gets you pretty close to making $100,000 in a year. So if in January, instead of making 12, not only did you not make 8, you only made 4, right? That's a place where the data has given you enough information right off the bat. you are not in the right trajectory from where you started. And so at that point, you may need to be looking at, okay, what is changing? Why is that happening? What's going on there? Mm-hmm. And even though it's very tiny data, it may be enough data without much gut, into the whole thing. And so part of it is using that intuition piece to say, do I have enough data? What is that data telling me? Is part of my intuition saying I need to stay the course and get more data? Mm-hmm. Or is the intuition telling me, no, what I really thought was going to happen just isn't going to happen for whatever reason, right? Because sometimes it's things within our control and sometimes it's with things outside of our control that we're dealing with. But part of it is doing that gut check on a regular basis to say, does this still feel like it's in alignment with where I'm going and what I'm wanting to do?
Okay. And I feel like I'm tracking. And I think you did a good job of also explaining that when we're interpreting our data, it's important to be as neutral as we can be with it. I mean, I think this is also one of those areas where if you can't be neutral, like if money genuinely freaks you out, because there are people that are genuinely freaked out by dollars and cents, then, bring in a business advisor, finance person, whoever to like objectively help you interpret that data. But aside from that, it should be fairly easy to find a way to kind of divorce the emotion from the numbers you're seeing so that you're avoiding that like bias. But when we're looking at like some of our strategic indicators, the indicators that we should be paying attention to. So, we've got data, which are our numbers, and they could be anything from dollars to followers if we're looking at social media performance or marketing, could be churn rate if we're looking at client acquisition, churn rate, lead to sale timeline, all of that good stuff.
All the millions of things that people tell you should track.
Right. So those countable things is what I like to say. If they can be somehow deduced to a number of some sort.
I call it easy to measure. Things that are easy to measure.
Easy to measure. They tend to fall with a number value. That's your quantitative data. Then you've got your qualitative data, which is where I think people kind of get a little bit confused. First of all, because if you don't come from a research background, I think when we talk about qualitative data, that sounds super fancy and reliable. But then when we start to talk about the things that count as qualitative data, that sounds awful fuzzy and subjective. So
and it kind of is. Let's be honest. Qualitative data really is kind of gooey.
So unpack qualitative data for me and maybe like why it matters and even why it may not matter.
Yeah, so qualitative data really is where more of that emotion kinds of words fit in. It feels easy. It feels hard. It feels like it's gotten better. It feels faster, even though it may not be really measurable in the normal way that we think of time, right? Any of those kind of things tend to be where the qualitative data is. I feel like we're communicating better. I feel like we're our customers are happier. Now we can do some things that will put some quantitative measurements to that as well, but most of the time it's still a bit of a qualitative environment. One of the classics is the Net Promoter Score that everyone gets very excited about, and it's a good measure. Which basically the question is, on a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend our business to someone else that would need our services? It's worded in slightly different ways, but that's the gist of it. And because it's got a measurement 1 to 10, people consider it a very, kind of a quantitative piece. But to some degree, it's still qualitative, right? Because it's how likely are you to, it doesn't say how many times have you, right? It's how likely are you. And so it's like, well, I don't know that many people that would need the service, but probably I would recommend it because I've gotten good service. But at the same point, the next day, something could go slightly astray and be like, well, I'm not very likely at all today. Right. So there, as opposed to how many people have you referred our business to, that would be a real quantitative number, right? Because it's like, you have referred me 3 times. Okay, so we know that there are 3 referrals, and then we can chase that down. But how likely are you? Well, today I would give you a 9 out of 10 that I'm likely to refer you. And then another month from now, I might give you a 6 because something hasn't quite gone as well. So even sometimes our quantitative data really is also qualitative, which is how likely is it to stay the same on any given day in any given situation. Qualitative data often will vary some. Okay. Usually it won't vary lots unless something goes terribly astray, right? But if we're trying to put a measurement around like a 1 to 10, today it might be to 8, tomorrow it might be a 7, the next day it might be a 9, might be an 8, might be a 7, might be an 8, might be a 7, might be a 9. It's not going down to 1, and it's not, it's not doing those big things, but that it changes based on how we feel about things is a qualitative piece. And often we assign qualitative feelings toward our quantitative information, particularly like you were talking about, where I'm not really comfortable with numbers. And so I see this number and I've decided this number is bad. Well, the number itself's not bad. It's probably telling you something, but we feel bad about the number. Well, we don't actually need to feel bad about the number. We just need to understand what that number is telling. And so that qualitative data is really useful because it's often the source behind the quantitative data and is giving us better details about it, right? So when we see our revenue go up, yay, everyone's happy. That's a wonderful thing. But how do we feel about it going up? Right? There is a qualitative piece there. Is it way harder? Am I exhausted all the time?
Right.
Right? Because not every dollar is equal to every other dollar when it comes to our energy. Out in the world economically, my dollar and your dollar are exact same dollar to Amazon, right? But how I got my dollar and how you got your dollar may energetically feel very, very different. Right. And so that's where that qualitative piece is about the energy around it. And we've talked a lot that, the 3 big components in any business are money, time, and energy.
Yeah.
Money, easy to measure. Time, relatively easy to measure. Energy, super, super hard to measure. And where I consider qualitative measurements are often about energy in some form or fashion.
Okay. So, and it sounds to me like none of those is more important than the other.
I will always count data stronger, so quantitative than qualitative, because we aren't putting lots of other emotions around. Well, we can be, but but generally the data is the data. If I got $100,000 in this year in sales, I got $100,000 in on it. Now I can tell myself that it was an easy 100,000, or I can tell myself it was a hard 100,000, but it's still 100,000. So and then part of this is my own tendency. I will tend to weight slightly to the quantitative information because it's verifiable by a second source.
Okay. So you feel like it's more reliable.
It's a bit more reliable, but it doesn't mean that the qualitative data isn't important.
So I think in your example, what you're saying is the quantitative data tells us what, right? It tells us the behaviors or the actions that took place. And the qualitative data helps us give context to it.
It gives context. It gives some of the why. It sometimes gives a little bit of the how, right? Back to you and I could both make $100,000 this year, and you could say it was a really easy $100,000, and I could say it was a really hard $100,000, even if we were doing pretty much the same thing. That's a qualitative measurement about that $100,000, but we both made $100,000.
Okay. So when it comes to figuring out whether your strategy is working, especially when you're early into it, right? Early in a quarter, early in a year, or just at the early stage of a new strategy, a new initiative that you're trying. Walk us through your personal process, and then let us know if there's anything you would do differently or advise differently for maybe somebody listening? Because I know for you, sometimes it depends on stage of business and whatever, but how would you build out, your decision-making process? Like, what would you track? How often would you track it? What do you ignore early on that you might need to pay attention to later?
So you always need to be watching the money, because if you're not watching the money, then it's not actually a business. So there always has to be some measurements of money. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be revenue. It might be, and often I would encourage this as a better measurement, your profit. How much are you making after all you spend all the things that you have to spend to be able to make the money that you're making, right? So there needs to be some sort of a money measurement, always. It like it said, it can look like other things. Revenue as a top line number is often not a good data point, quite honestly, because it can lie. It can make it sound like we're doing really well when we're not. Back to, we could be selling $1 million, but our net profit could be negative 500,000, which means it's costing us $1.5 million to make that million. I'm not sure that's actually good numbers, right?
Right.
So understanding, what are we needing to track, and what are we needing to track now? Because that's the other thing, is sometimes those things will change over time, right? When you're first starting out, probably sales, top line revenue is a good number to be tracking. But after you get past that product market fit stage, that may not be the best number. It may be back down to, what is my gross profit? What am I making after, if I'm selling a product, or my cost of delivering the services or things like that, or my net profit? That may be a much more important number than the revenue per se. Okay. So part of it is always going to be money. Then there are the things that are the drivers toward the money that are measurable. Sometimes that's marketing things, it's sales calls, it could be followers, it could, there's a whole plethora of those pieces. And it's always going to change as your business grows and matures, right? So some of the things that we're tracking early on won't necessarily be the things that we're tracking later on. Okay. There are some things, like I said, that are, overall are universal. But they're still a little more generic than specific. At any given point, Coca-Cola is always looking at their money, but they may be looking at certain numbers differently than they're looking at other numbers, right? As opposed to, you and I, as very, very micro businesses by comparison. We should be looking at our money too, but I'm sure we're looking at it very differently than Coca-Cola is, right? And, if we have employees, then there's staffing hours and some of those things that we may want to be looking at. Are we actually getting a return on the investment that we're making in our employees? Because they are also a resource that we're investing in, right? So that can be something else that we're looking at. But the data will vary, and it varies very much depending on your industry. There's all sorts of variables there that you're going to be looking at. We've talked in previous ones about, now I've lost the word that I want to use, but utilization, where if we're a service-based business, how much are we actually billing out, right? That's a different kind of measurement. But those are all those data pieces. But as we're looking at the data, we do want to look at the qualitative pieces of it to say, does the energy toward these data pieces match the energy I expect to put toward getting these levels of data, points of data? So for me, if we're looking at, one of the things that we joke a lot about with us is, I love being on a Zoom call in ways that most people do not understand and cannot process, right? And so for me, how is my energy being used in a day? And if it's being used on being on client calls and other types of Zoom calls, that's good use of my energy. And that's a qualitative measurement, right? How does that feel? We can track the time and we can say, yeah, Gwen was on 6 hours of Zoom calls today. And so that's a time measurement. But it also is, how does my energy feel for that, right? And so are we picking tactics to solve our strategic problem that are matching qualitative measurements as well as our quantitative measurements. Because if the way that I, reach $1 million, we keep using that as a random number, but if the way that I reach $1 million is that I need to sit and manually send out 100 emails every day and hardly talk to anybody, it is not worth $1 million in my world.
Right.
Now, there is someone else who's hearing that. It's like, oh, that would be the best thing ever.
Wait, you mean I can just type all day and never talk to a soul? Yes.
Yes, I am in, right? And so that's where the qualitative measurement works, right? Is we want to be looking at, is the energy that we're putting toward the thing also something that we can sustain over a long term for whatever strategic problem that we're trying to solve. Sometimes it is we've got to do this for 3 months. It's going to be miserable, but we know we can stop after that, right? But other times it's like, no, looks like the way that we have to do business. And it's like, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Right? That's the qualitative business. That's the qualitative question. And so when we're first starting out, we don't have a lot of data. And so we tend to focus more on qualitative assessments. But also we don't have a lot of data there either.
Right.
And so it's tempting to make lots of shifts really fast. But part of that then is we don't ever get enough consistent data. Right? As we get further and more mature, I think we can start going back to, we can use our instinct, which is part of where our qualitative data is coming from, right? Along with the data and be able to say, oh no, we need to actually pivot faster than what we thought we were going to.
Yeah. Okay. So pause there for just a second. Cause I think
you said I could talk 90% of the time this time.
I did. But I just want to make sure that everybody can catch up here. So, the question I asked was kind of what to track, how often, what to ignore. And so I think you've given us a really good representation of the things that are important to track. Obviously, tracking the money that comes in is important. Tracking how hard it feels to bring that money in, equally important. Maybe tracking even like what it entails to bring that money in. Not to mention the profitability piece, right? How much does it cost us to bring that money in and to support
and to deliver?
To deliver, like all of that, right? So really tracking the cost, the revenue, and sort of how they interplay with each other, in addition to effort, energy, bandwidth, capacity, all of that. We haven't talked about what to ignore, but I want to set that aside for a moment because you were leading us so beautifully into the next piece. And I think the next piece will cover the what to ignore piece and I also feel like you were leading us kind of beautifully into some ways to simplify this whole process because there's no shortage of things that we could be tracking. And so the next sort of item that I want to bring up that you were kind of heading us toward is, so you're chugging along and you get to a place where it might be a bump in the road. It might be a gigantic hole. It might be a cliff. We don't really know, but it doesn't feel good. What are the signals that we need to be paying attention to that help us understand whether we stick with it, right? We just kind of jump over the bump in the road or, try to, I don't know, what is the thing when you lunge over the hole, versus, plunging off the cliff, or when we need to pivot, we need to turn around, we need to go around. What are those signals?
To me, it's the difference between doing it with a panicked reactive instinct as opposed to a thought out proactive instinct.
Okay.
Because if we're paying attention, we actually know there's potentially a cliff there. Like we can see it's like there's something funky happening on the horizon there. And so in a proactive approach, it's like, okay, we need to be paying closer attention, right? And be thinking about what some alternatives are. Using the cliff, I'm kind of using the Thelma and Louise, driving off the cliff example, that instead of hitting the gas, we actually slow down so that we can see it in time to put on the brakes.
Right.
Right. So to me, that's the difference between the panic, like all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, there's something here. And we just react. There are emergencies. They are so few. We treat so many things like emergencies that are not. How bad is it going to be if we take a week to think about this as opposed to making the decision today? Right. The other thing, and this happened with one of our clients, where they panicked. And so what they did is they made a change they knew that would allow some things to work, but they very specifically didn't tell the people that it would negatively affect. And they also didn't tell me. And when they did tell me, because it did negatively affect somebody that then found out, and it was like, that's kind of problematic for me that you're doing this thing. And and I was like, yeah, you got to own up to it. And I said, you knew that you really shouldn't do that, right? And she's like, yeah, no, I knew. I said, because if you had done it strategically, you would have told everybody that you were doing it. You wouldn't be afraid to talk to me about it because I wouldn't say, what the hell? Right? And so part of it is, are you trying to do it on the sly? Are you doing it in a stealthy way? A stealthy way means it's not what you actually need to do. This is where you're letting your emotion take over your instinct, right? And so part of it is to say, oh, that may be a problem. Let's start thinking about it, as opposed to, oh, I'm just going to react because something didn't quite go right. And it's the question of, so did it not go right 100% of the time, or did it not go right 1% of the time? Because it not going right 1% of the time probably means it's normal, right? If it's not going right 100% of the time, then we probably need to change, but we probably can take a couple days to talk about what really is the best change, as opposed to, I'm just going to hit the gas and go flying off, because maybe I can jump the gorge.
Right. Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is that the signals that matter are going to vary depending on what you're doing, what you're working on. Like, I always love a good, very practical example, but it's hard, right? Because when we're talking strategy, it's so varied from business to business, but the signals that matter are the ones that you look at and go, ooh, this could be the sign of something really good. This could be the sign of something really bad. In either case, this is a sign. We need to keep watching this. We need to watch this closely. So for instance, to your earlier example about a trend, when you look and you're like, okay, so we have sold 5 fewer units this week than last week. Something could be going on in the world. That could be a market shift. That could be a lot of things. But if next week we sell 5 units fewer than we sold this week, that could also be a bump in the road, or that could be a sign of a downward trend, right? That's why we have to keep watching it, because if we keep dropping 5 units week after week after week, we're going to have a really rough year. But it doesn't mean that when we drop the 5 units the first time that we need to make any changes. And I think that's what you're saying is always be paying attention to anything that, if it continues the way it's continuing, could mean great things for you or could mean really bad things for you.
Right. And it really is about being proactive about it and saying, well, if that is true, I like your 5 units drop kind of situation. So, okay, 5 units drop. So if that keeps happening for another, give it a period of time, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something that feels like we're actually starting to get some data, what would we need to do, and start planning that now so that if it happens, we're actually moving into something that we thought through, as opposed to all of a sudden going, oh, it's been 8 weeks and we've lost 5 units of sales every week for the last 8 weeks. Let's do blank.
Let's have a fire sale so that we sell more units at a loss. That actually doesn't help our bottom line.
Yeah. So it becomes a reactive. And so to me, the real piece here is strategy is not about being reactive.
Yeah.
Strategy is about being proactive, which means we have to be thinking ahead. Doesn't necessarily mean we have to be taking action, but we have to be thinking ahead about what action we would take and why we think that will actually change their trajectory, whatever trajectory we happen to be on, positive or negative.
Okay. And so with that, I just have one more question because it kind of goes back to the earlier point you made about, how it feels. Somebody makes a suggestion of emailing your people twice a week instead of once a week. And it's like, in your gut, like that feels right or that doesn't feel right. How do you separate discomfort though from misalignment? Because sometimes I think sometimes we can convince ourselves that we're just uncomfortable when actually there's misalignment. Like you knew you shouldn't have married that guy, ladies. You just knew. You did it anyway. It's okay. You knew it wasn't cold feet. You knew that this was a warning sign, but you did it anyway. Okay. Like we've all had some kind of experience. Maybe it was just a date you shouldn't have gone on. But there's other times, right, when we're like, oh no, this is going to go really bad. This doesn't make sense, but it's really just fear talking. Do you have any tips on how we separate the two?
Honestly, it's practice. I think that's the only thing it really is being very aware and saying, and my earlier example of saying, well, this felt like intuition and I felt like I was right, but I really don't know. And waiting to see what the outcome is.
Yeah.
And starting to say, oh yeah, this was different than that. Right. And this is where I talk about being able to separate the emotion from the intuition is really about watching and saying, when did I say no? And looking back, I can tell it was fear or discomfort or any of those things. And where did I say no or yes? I mean, either side, but we're using no for the moment. And I was right, even though I still can't explain it. And saying how, and starting to be able to say, this felt this way, this felt this way. They were very, very close. But over time, you can start saying, oh no, this is this kind of thing over here. And this is this other kind of thing over here. And because I don't think there's an easy answer. I really don't, because I do believe, as women in this society and based on, kind of how we're wired, that we do for a long, long time early in our lives, conflate emotion and instinct. And so we have to practice at separating it.
Yeah. So then the answer to the question, I didn't know we were going to end here, but really the answer to the question is the only way to know whether your strategy is working is to constantly practice evaluating whether your strategy is working.
Yep.
Because in the consistent practice of evaluation is when you start figuring out your particular or your business's particular mix of indicators that tell you whether things are about to go sideways or not. But that consistent practice helps you get out of that reactive path. Because I think all of us, the first time we're encountered with something going sideways, will be reactive. We don't know any better. We don't have a different pathway. But the more we do it, the less reactive we become because we develop a library of experience in, oh, wait, I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends.
Right.
And so, I think that's the main thing, right? Is what you're telling us is it's consistent practice. And the more we practice with awareness, not just going through the motions, the better we get time and time again. And what this episode really has been, Gwen, and it's been amazing actually, is it's been a workout. It's been a mental workout. Like I feel like I just ran a mental marathon in the best way possible. And so what I want to say is, this kind of work is actually a great way to strengthen that CEO brain. Right? This is what CEO thinking is really about. 'Cause that reactive stuff, that's really much more at the individual contributor level, right? Just trying to keep your head above water. So to really be a CEO is you've got to like practice this kind of thought process. And if this is the sort of thing that you want to get better practice at, you want to strengthen your CEO brain week in, week out, then I strongly suggest you get on Gwen's weekly question email, because the question email is probably the best thing that we put out. Definitely the best thing we put out for free, but it might be one of the best things we put out there, because every single week it is just one single question dropped into your inbox, because we get that the last thing you need are more answers or more information. What you need is a really good question to help you get into that CEO train of thought and start thinking of ways to be much more proactive in the running of your business. And in order to get on that list, to get that email every week, you just go to everydayeffectiveness.com/question. Whether you sign up on Sunday, you sign up on Thursday, you will get your first email the following Friday. That's just how it works, because we don't inundate your inbox. You just get one question a week and it comes on Friday. Until next time, I want you to think about what might be different if you spent just 15 to 30 minutes per week in the coming 2 weeks, really exercising that CEO brain of yours. And let us know how that works out for you. All the details are in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallyWant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.